The Meeples and Miniatures podcast is sponsored by Two Fat Lardies and Coat Dance Paints, and also by the generous donations of you, the listener. Thank you to everyone for your support. The Meeples and Miniatures podcast, episode 112. Battlegroup Overlord and Chain of Command, with Neil Shook, Mike Hobbs and Mike Whitaker. This show was recorded on Friday the 30th of August 2013. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Meeples and Miniatures podcast with me, your host, Neil Shook. On today's show we're discussing a couple of World War II rule sets. A bit later on in the show we're going to be discussing Chain of Command. Now I know we've talked about this before, however Chain of Command has now been released, and so having got the rulebook in our hands, it's a chance to look at everything that we hadn't really covered in the past. Some people may say it's a bit overexposure, but considering how good a rule set it is, I really think it's worth going over the bits we haven't covered before, which are basically things like force lists, scenarios, that sort of thing. And then we are joined by Mike Hobbs for some further roundtable discussion. However, before then, myself and Mike Hobbs talk about Battlegroup Overlord, which is the latest release from Plastic Soldier Company, and they are the army lists for the Normandy campaign for their Battlegroup rules, which was released with the Kursk supplement last year. So, lots to get through, so we'll take a quick break, and when we come back we'll be discussing Battlegroup Overlord.
Medic! I don't like it, Sergeant. Me neither, sir. Good Lord, it's really looking pretty bad. Yes, sir. It happens every time, sir. It's too predictable, sir. How far do you think we've advanced, Sergeant? 6 inches, sir. It's always 6 inches. We advance 6 inches, then Jerry gets a go. The lads are calling it Hi-Go, Hugo, sir. Hi-Go, Hugo? Good grief. And they don't like it, sir. Oh, not like it. Seems pretty straightforward to me. Rather like cricket. We have an innings, then the other chap does. Well, that's all very well, sir, cricket, sir, but begging your pardon, it ain't like that, sir, in war. I don't think Mr. Hitler plays like that. What, Hitler? No, gosh, he'd like to go all the time. Oh, Lord, sir, lovely. Oh, well, sir, anyway, sir, it's like this, sir. If it carries on like this, Hi-Go, Hugo, me and the lads won't be coming to your Thursday evening games club, and that's the way it is, sir. Looking for more of a challenge with your World War II games? Are you tired of the predictability of Hi-Go, Hugo systems? Iron Bean Shopman provides real command challenges on an unpredictable battlefield. Two Fat Lardies, playing the period and not the rules since 2002. Pip pip.
Well, in this part of the show, myself and Mike H are going to talk about a recent release from Plastic Soldier Company and Iron Fist Publications. That is their Battlegroup Overlord campaign or scenario book. Battlegroup Kursk was released last September, so this time last year. It included both the basic rules for the game and the first supplement, which was Kursk, which surprised many people, but it kind of fitted in with the product line that was at the time available from Plastic Soldier Company, as it was primarily Germans and Russians. Well, unsurprisingly, the first campaign supplement was going to be Normandy. Everybody was seen to be crying out for it. And so at Salute this year, they released Battlegroup Overlord, which, funnily enough, covers the Normandy campaign.
It does indeed.
Indeed. So, bare bones wise, it's a hardback book, 240 pages, produced in full colour. The first thing of note is that this is only a campaign supplement. It doesn't include the basic rules of the game. So, if you didn't want to do Kursk, what they actually did was that they released separately an A5 paperback copy of the basic rules, which runs to 64 pages. Again, produced in full colour, but is just the basic rules. So, if you didn't want to buy the original Kursk book, you can still play Battlegroup Overlord, but you need to buy the supplementary rulebook.
Yeah, which is actually quite a nice little purchase, because it's handy for taking on the club.
Absolutely.
You don't need the full book when you get on the club.
No, so having one of those things, yes, it is quite small. It doesn't include some of the fluff that was included in the original Battlegroup Kursk size. So yes, it's a nice handy reference book. Yeah, in a similar sort of way, I suppose, to something like the small rule books that are produced for things like 40k and Warhammer Fantasy Battle. It's of a similar sort of ilk to those. So it's really good reference material, and doesn't mean that it means that you don't have to cart a 240 page hardback book around with you.
Yeah. So very good.
Yeah. So, as far as actual content is concerned, essentially it's a book of two halves. It covers both the initial landings itself, which is actually fairly extensively covered, and then it covers the rest of the Normandy campaign.
Yeah, and I think it says the Normandy campaign, but I think you can use it up through probably to the end of 44 quite easily.
Looking forward, there are obviously there are more campaign books planned for Market Garden and also for the Ardennes Offensive. Having chatted to Will Townsend at Plastic Soldier Company, I know that they're coming. However, in the meantime, this is perfectly serviceable for stuff the whole way through 1944.
Yeah, I'd say so. Especially when you start getting into sort of Holland and that sort of area.
That's it. But essentially, at this point in time, if you're wondering about a cut-off, this basically, from a campaign setting point of view, this basically cuts off at the end of the fellow's pocket.
Yeah.
Which is, a fairly standard cut-off point for for the campaign at the time.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. Okay, so essentially, it's a book of army lists.
Yes, at the end of the day, that's exactly what it is. It's like you say, it's split up into two parts. You've got the covering of D-Day and Aftermath, and you've got the battles afterwards. And there's different army lists for each of those. And also there's new rules that they've introduced and scenarios for each of those sections as well.
Yeah.
So you've literally got almost like two supplements in one, shall we say. I think some of the army lists can be used in other areas. Like in the first section, you get the British Airborne Division. You get the
it's specifically 6th Airborne as opposed to 1st Airborne.
Yeah. And also the American Airborne as well. But I think those could be quite. You can use those later on if you wish. if you had to. Although they are sort of, as with anything with the Battlegroup games, they are specifically tailored for that particular campaign. So you might find some tweaks, and sort of the orders of battle might be different to what you would expect later on. But it's done at a particular moment in time. But I mean, is it worth us going through the army list to give people an idea?
Yeah. I mean, there were 13. There were 13 army lists in total.
Mm-hmm.
In the first half of the book, which covers D-Day itself, you've got. Are you sitting comfortably? Right. British 6th Airborne Battle Group, British Amphibious Assault Battle Group, American Airborne Division Battle Group, American Amphibious Assault Battle Group, German Atlantic Wall Resistance Nest, and Panzer Erz's Battle Group. So with those 6 lists, that essentially covers all you need for D-Day itself.
And possibly a couple of days afterwards, I think. I think they've possibly, especially with the inclusion of the 21st Panzer Division, I think they're sort of pushing that on to, what do you say, possibly a few days after D-Day? Possibly a week afterwards?
I suppose effectively, unless you're talking about, airborne operations, especially American airborne operations on the day, pretty much it's a case of it's a few days late. It's up to a couple of days later. Yeah. But the lists are very much tailored towards the amphibious assault phase of the landing.
Yeah. And it's quite interesting to see those lists. I mean, there's lots of nice stuff in there. They got nice rules in there for doing the beach landings. How to handle things like landing craft and the heavier defences that you had, obviously on the Atlantic Wall. So it's quite interesting. I haven't played any of the landing games yet. I've gone for the sort of slightly later ones, but they look quite interesting.
It's one of these things that I suppose, because they're fairly specialist especially in what kit you need, the number of landing craft and various other bits and pieces. Although it's, beach assaults and stuff are always interesting games to try, it's something that a lot of people don't tend to do that often.
No, they're quite difficult to actually play.
You're kind of thinking back and wishing, I wish back in the day I bought an absolute shed load of, remember the old air-fixed plastic landing craft?
Yeah.
They used to have this vinyl moulded plastic landing craft.
Yes.
Which these days you kind of think, you could sell a whole ton of. I mean, okay, it wasn't the best model on the market, but in any way, shape or form. But if you wanted a cheap landing craft, there you go.
Yep, absolutely. Indeed. Together with those army lists, you've also got 4 nice scenarios as well. So you've got a beachhead scenario, the Omaha one, the storming of the Lafayette Causeway.
Yes.
Which I must admit, I haven't actually read much about that, but I think it's quite a pivotal one early on. But the one I was interested in was Beville.
Yeah.
Because that's a game that I last played using Alpha World War II. And it was a 2-day battle with 8 very good mates and a pub right in the middle. And that was a great... So it's quite interesting looking at that scenario and looking at the one that I played and doing the comparison. There's some good stuff in there for the early part. Yeah,
and again, right across both sets of army lists, there's actually quite a nice spread of level of game as well. There's a couple of platoon level games. It's primarily aimed at company level, but there's a couple of big ones in there as well.
Yeah, I think some of those will take a while to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then of course we move on to section 2, which is probably the sort of Operation Goodwood's sort of era.
Yeah, they term it Beyond the Beaches.
Yeah. So it probably takes us up to the sort of Falaise Gap. It's after they worked out that they weren't going to catch a car on the first day or the first week. It's that sort of grind around through the bocage and trying to fight their way through.
That's it, and this is as you say, this is where the main meat, as far as the army lists are concerned, as you say, pretty much for the rest of 1944. So you've got a British Armoured Division, British Infantry Division, American Armoured Division, American Infantry Division, and then you've got German Panzer, German Fallschirmjäger, and standard German here. So, everything you'd expect.
Yeah, and they're good lists, I must admit. There's a lot of stuff in them. And quite interesting. And again, we've got another 4 nice big scenarios. So there's the wreckage screen, the holding the Karatan. God Honor a Country was an interesting one, which is the Polish attack.
Yeah.
And then the closing of the Falaise Gap.
Yes, at Fromental, which is that's again some really interesting scenarios, and I suppose it just shows you the breadth of what's available. I mean, having said that, only having 8 scenarios in the campaign book, was that something? I mean, do you think that's okay? Do you think it would have been nice to have some more? What was your feeling on it?
I thought it was enough. I mean, you've got the basic throw-up games, for Demo Club. They're in the other book. I think they're also in the small pocket book as well.
Yeah,
sort of basic ones. These are sort of very specific historical scenarios. You're not going to play these more than once or twice. There's a lot of stuff in a lot of these scenarios. So these are things I think that possibly a club would put on for a weekend game.
Or very much display game for a show sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, these are big set piece campaign style scenarios. Although they didn't do what they did in Kursk, which was have the interlocking scenarios. So you had a bigger battle and you had separate parts of it.
No, which is surprising in some ways, because especially either taking something like Goodwood, for example, or perhaps taking some of the operations around the breakout into Brittany, and the actions around St. Lo and stuff like that. It could very easily have a set of linked scenarios around there, and so the fact that they didn't do that is, well, I suppose there is so much to do. I think that is the thing. So half the time it's so much more a question of what do you leave out as opposed to what do you keep in, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they could have done something. I mean, it's a bit of a shame that they didn't do any sort of campaign sort of link scenario system in here. But as you say, I mean, they're trying to cover, 2 or 3 months of very, very intense fighting, in a very small period. So whatever they would have done, people would have just had a go at them.
That's
it. Than their favourite one. So yeah,
that's it. And to be honest, it's not as if the subject hasn't been covered elsewhere.
Exactly. There's an awful lot of very, very good scenarios for this period. And I think what's good about this book is you get the army list, and it's the army list that that we want. There's a lot of history in this book. They really have gone to town on the background. If anyone's got the Kursk book, it's similar quality to the Kursk book. There's a lot of in-depth information. Information on not just on the campaign, but also on the troops, on the armour, all sorts of stuff in there. But there's a lot of the army lists are very big.
Yeah, so as you say, there is an awful lot of history packed into this, which is, but in some ways, I think, well, from my point of view, both a good and a bad thing, because especially it's actually essentially 2 campaign books in one, because it's covering the landing and then it's covering the campaign, the campaign in Normandy afterwards.
Yeah.
You've got 2 sections of history. And, I mean, in the landing section, you've got this, it's 16 pages worth of literally minute by minute. This is what happened here. This is what happened then. Now, while I don't deny it's all very interesting, and especially if you don't know the campaign particularly well or what have you, it's invaluable information and useful for looking at which bits of the campaign do you want to do and and how you want to fit things in if you want to be right smack up historically correct with with everything you're doing. However, it's done at there's only so much you can fit in a book. So the big difference between this and Kursk is the fact that there isn't any sort of modelling section in this book. It's all taken up with the history. Yeah,
I wonder whether that's something that they're going to continue doing. That they're now doing these. They're almost becoming reference books for a particular campaign. Very in-depth information. Because with the stuff you got in you and the army lists and the scenarios, you can use that, I would say, with any game system.
Oh, certainly.
The only thing that's making this, relevant to Battlegroup rules are the sort of third section, which is the breakdown and the stats for each vehicle. You take that apart, you've got a damn fine reference for any World War II game you want to play. So maybe that's what they're trying to push, the fact that these are basically primers for a particular campaign that just happen to work with Battlegroup rules.
Maybe that's the case. I mean, but I certainly can't see anything against putting a hobby section in there. Again, especially if they're aimed at a particular market. I mean, certainly, if you look at Kursk, if you look at Battlegroup Kursk, that was almost aimed at a very broad market, right from people who are experienced wargamers right down to people who it's their first game sort of thing. But as you say, you can only fit so much in. And I mean, one thing I thought about was perhaps part of the issue here is simply you look at what takes the time to do stuff, and you imagine the amount of time it takes to put together modelling guides.
Yeah.
With the amount of photos you've got to do and captioning them all and just putting the whole thing together, they are probably one of the most labour-intensive parts of the books to do.
Mm.
And especially, I seem to remember from chatting to Warwick that they were under a little bit of time pressure as far as getting this out. And I'm just wondering if it got to the point where they thought, hang on a second, we haven't got time to put this in the book, and that's why it's not there.
It might be. I mean, it might be a case of they've, had a straw poll of the people who bought this and sort of try to work out. Maybe in the first book they didn't know how well it would be taken or who would pick up the rules. Maybe now they've got a better idea of the type of person who's going to buy these rules. So maybe they have decided to say, okay, we're going to go for the sort of hardcore World War II player. I don't know. It's something for them. I mean, they've obviously made that decision, and we can just wonder why.
Yes.
I don't feel any great loss by not having a modelling section. I think there's a lot of those. I'm quite interested more in the history, and having the history there, and it's well written as well. It's quite good.
Yeah, it's very accessible. Yeah, it is very, very accessible. As you say, very well done, very well researched. It's quite obvious that Warwick's done his homework and knows his stuff. So, as you say, with the whole thing of it being a reference book for a reference book for World War II and not just for the battle group rules. I mean, obviously, when it comes down to the army lists, the army lists are designed around the way you would build the army list in Battlegroup. So, it is designed around relatively historically correct orders of battle. So not shed loads of tigers, all that sort of thing. It's very much based around infantry companies, tank platoons, and then limited numbers of support depending on what main troop options you bought.
But that's quite self-contained, isn't it? I mean, you can literally, you can just turn and say, okay, let's play a 600 point game from these rules, and we're going to play with, pick your rule of choice. Iron Beam Shotman, Flames of War, Battlefront World War II, and another 20 or 30 different sets of rules that you want to play with.
Quite.
So that sort of works. I think the thing that I don't like about them, and it's not just about these rules, it's probably World War II rules in general, is there's so many different stats for so many different types of vehicles. You do have the constant page turning trying to get the information. And I know that you brought us up with the curse ones, and I went, no, don't worry about it. It does kind of bug me a bit. I think with the curse rules, the reason I wasn't too worried about it was because somebody on the Yahoo group actually made up a whole bunch of sort of cards for each vehicle, or little stats for each vehicle that you could cut out, laminate, and you got them there. There's none of that for these, and there's an awful lot more vehicles in this book than I think there is in the curse book.
Oh, very much so.
I think that the Battlegroup guys as a whole need to find a way of getting that information easier to hand for players. I mean, there is a very good website that a guy called Greg has put together, but he's not allowed to actually, even though you can choose the army group from that, and it's really good for putting together army groups, and it lets you know what you can take and what you can't take, and it gives you the points and all that sort of stuff. The one thing he wasn't allowed to put in there was the stats for each vehicle. So he literally has to put a little box at the bottom of the printout page, which would say something like Churchill or Sherman, and then have a bunch of blank boxes that you need to go and fill in. And it's just a shame that they haven't given him the permission to go and basically hold that data in the website and just print it out.
But having said that, that is, at the same time, that is kind of part of the core of the rules, isn't it? So you can see why they've denied it, because otherwise, why would you go? Why would you have to buy the rules?
Yeah, well, it's a tough one. Or maybe they, I think they could do something, even if it was a paid for system. Almost like going back to the old Battlefront rules, which I do love. When you bought those, you got sort of glossy sheets with cards on them that you cut out, and there's one card per vehicle, and that came with the rules. If they produce something like that you could, I'd be quite happy to spend, 15, 20 quid or whatever it was to buy, nicely printed out cards for each vehicle or each type of unit that you got as a reference. Because then when you play a game, I mean, let's be honest, whenever you play a World War II game, you only ever have a handful of different types of vehicles. So if you have a card for each vehicle, it's there in front of you, and you can refer to it. With this and a lot of other rules, you page turn all the time. I started doing this playing Spearhead about 15 years ago. You're constantly going through the rules, trying to find the stats.
Yeah, just to explain basically what the way they've split it, and it's a common feature I've found in other games as well. Effectively, where you've got the rule sets, the rules for each vehicle. In one point, you've got their rules for their movement type and what their armor value is. However, their armament, because you have a standard number of guns used across a whole host of vehicles, it tells you, okay, fine, right, it's this movement, these armor values, and it's armed with this gun. You have to turn over several pages to find the stats for the gun. And that's where the pain really comes in, because as you say, you're constantly page flipping depending on whether you're moving, whether you're firing, what have you, and just having a simple index card with all that information available, makes life so much easier. It's untrue.
Yeah, and I do have to sort of ask the question. I mean, how much of an intellectual property is that to a rules writer? I would have turned around and said that the army list creation is probably more. I don't know. There's no easy fix for it. But I just know it can be a pain, and unless somebody goes and writes out the stats and puts them somewhere that people can use, whether hopefully with the permission of the designer, it does make playing these games tricky.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, you kind of wonder the question. How many extra pages would it have cost to put, a vehicle as a 3-line stat instead of a 2-line stat, for example. I suppose it's a case of with an awful lot of vehicles, the page count soon mounts up. So,
I guess the problem is I would imagine that they're putting this stuff together during playtesting and tweaking it. Now, it's fine to tweak a single line in a single table to say, like, this 75mm gun has this stats. If you've then got to change those stats on 20 or 30 pages, that's when human error creeps in and you get typos.
Yeah. Yeah, so you can see in some ways that's potentially another reason why they did it the way they did.
Yeah. And you say, it's not just these rules. It's one of the things with a lot of World War II rules. Let's be honest. They're all the same. They've all got the same number of vehicles because that's the vehicles that are in there. And the only ones I think who's ever really come across or sort of fixed that problem is the old Battlefront rules, and that's because they had the cards. Although it was a right pain having to collect the cards, but I got piles of them.
Yeah, as I say, there are one or two, and perhaps you don't get the problem so much in smaller level games. Yeah. You start to think about things like Victory Decision, and even something like Chain of Command, for example, where you don't necessarily get vehicle stats are all in one place. Having said that, these are actually probably a little bit more complex than some of the other, than some of those rule sets as well. So perhaps not the best comparison. As you say, when you're looking at similar level complexity, they all tend to hit the same sort of issues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So. But that's it. That's the only thing I don't like about them. And it's not just them. It's so many other sets of rules. So that's just my general gripe about some World War II rules. But I think we can blame Hitler for having far too many different types of vehicles.
Indeed. So So I think on the whole, I think it's if you want to play Western Front and you like Battlegroup rules, it's a no-brainer. It's a book you got to own. Yeah,
and I would say it's for others. If you play other sets of rules of a similar level, it's a good primer. There's a lot of information in there. There's a lot of stuff you can lift into other games quite easily. So if you're into Normandy World War II, buy it. It's a very pretty book.
Yes. I was about to say. I mean, the one thing we haven't discussed is the fact that it production value wise, it is done really, really well. It's very pretty. Lots of pictures, both of models and period pictures as well. Very, very well produced. So from that sort of thing, no arguments. It's a very pretty book. Nice for a war games coffee table. It's good to see as well that they are now looking at rolling out these books on a fairly regular basis. We've just had notification that The Fall of the Reich, which is the next supplement, has just got up for pre-order.
That'd be an interesting one as well.
Yeah. I mean that is basically well, as far as we can gather, that I suppose effectively the assault on Berlin.
Yeah, now that's going to be interesting to see how they handle doing big city fights.
That's it, because I mean, from the blurb we've seen, that's handling late war Germans, US, Brits, and Russians. So the only way that is going to happen is actually around that final push on Berlin, as far as we can see.
Yeah, it's sort of crossing the line bits, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then they've got, I think they've announced that they're doing Barbarossa next, and then North Africa. What 2 books on North Africa apparently.
Oh right. I mean, I'm quite surprised they're not going back and doing Market Garden. Although, as you say, you can get away with doing Market Garden with the lists you've got in this book. So it's not as if you can't do it. Yeah.
I think North Africa might be pushed by Will at Plastic Surgery Company.
Oh yes.
Yeah. That's 2 books, please, Dad. Thank you very much.
Yes, and of course, from a from that side of things, by the time that comes out, which is probably going to be another year, they'll be well into production of more early war stuff, which from our interviews with Will, we know that's what he's into anyway, and lots of tanks. Yes. One of the few campaigns you can get away with. Lots of tanks. So I'd say other than Kursk, but yes. So interesting stuff to look forward to. And if they're produced to the same level of this, looking forward to seeing what they've got.
Yeah, I am going to get another shelf, I think, just to hold these these bad boys.
This is it. Yes, they are fairly. Yeah, it's a fairly weighty tome. It has to be said. Yeah. So it's available from, obviously direct from Plastic Soldier Company. It's designed for 15 or 20 mil. I think actually it's probably aimed more at the 20 mil market than the 15 mil market, but it's playable equally with both. And obviously your friendly local gaming shop carries it as well. And it's 30 quid.
About that, yeah.
It's actually
worth. Yeah, I think it's worth it.
Yeah. So there we go. The Meeples and Miniatures podcast is very happy to be sponsored by Coat d'Arms Paints. Now, Coat d'Arms have been supporting miniatures painters with their products for well over 20 years in some way, shape or form. Their current range is 150 sets of acrylic paint, which are available both as individual colours, but also in paint sets depending on period. Things such as the Ancients paint set, the World War II German, World War II American, World War II Russian paint sets. And they also include things like an ACW set and even a Horsetown set. That's one way to purchase your paints. And they also do triads. Now, if you're a fan of the 3-colour system, made famous by the likes of people like Kevin Dallymore, you may like to purchase your paints with a dark shade, a medium shade and a highlight. And the triad system from Coat d'Arms allows you to do this. They also have ranges of textured paints called Brushscape, which allow you to paint from textures onto bases as well as colour. And these are ideal especially for smaller scale models. And if you're a fan of the dip method of painting, then Coat d'Arms have their own product available called Super Shader. This is available in light brown, dark brown and black. Coat d'Arms Paints have a whole range of products available to try. Check them out at www.blackhat.co.uk and be sure to tell them that we sent you. Well, for this part of the show, I'm joined by Mike Whitaker. Hi, Mike. Welcome back.
Good to be back.
And we're going to talk about Chain of Command. Now, I know we've talked a lot about Chain of Command on this show in the last few months. Obviously, there's the interview that we did with Rich and Nick following a day we spent playing the game. And then in the following show, myself and Mike talked about extra bits and pieces that we'd thought about following the interview. However, we're now in a position where we have the rulebook in our hands.
And boy, is it nice.
It is a very nice one.
It's a beautiful piece of work. If you haven't seen it yet, it's a matte grey cover with a very nice, one of those clever effect where you black and white picture with some of it picked out in colour on the cover. What have we got? 104 pages.
Mm-hmm.
Nicely laid out. There's even an index, as we commented last time, there's actually an index at the back and it works.
Indeed.
It's very clearly laid out. Lots of very pretty illustrations. Most of which I suspect are Mr. Clark's toys.
Very much so. I mean, anybody who has seen any of the battle reports that Rich has posted on the Two Fat Lardies blog will find some of the shots, if not the same, at least very similar.
Familiar.
Strangely familiar, yes. The scenery and some of the models are strangely familiar. You'll have a sense of deja vu.
But there's also a few other nice things. He's got a lovely 28mm Churchill AVRE in here somewhere, which I was quite surprised by. I didn't realise anybody did one. But beautiful stuff, well laid out, really clear and easy to read. Divided up in chapters. There's a quote from assorted World War II writings at the head of every chapter, which is sort of apropos to the chapter, which make good reading. Nice clear diagrams. It's probably, I think, it's better laid out than I Ain't Been Shotman and Dux Britanniarum, which I think were the two that set their standard before then. I think this.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, anybody who's seen I Ain't Been Shotman, I Ain't Been Shotman version 3, which came out last year, and also Dux Britanniarum, will know that Two Fat Lardies have really upped their game as far as production values is concerned, and a Chain of Command is very similar. As you were saying, actually, probably, it's gone one better again. So, I mean, I must admit, having looked at it, the first thing I thought of it is very much of an ilk of I Ain't Been Shotman, which, considering it's a World War II set of rules, it's nice because it's kind of it stays in keeping. So now you've got your platoon level and you've also got your company level, and actually similar sort of style, but as you say,
the armour rules are very similar. But then that was a given, I think.
Yeah, but as I say, as far as production values and stuff are concerned, yeah, a few extra bits and pieces added, a few lessons learned.
I know I'm harping on about it, but the index is definitely one of them.
Did you have anything to do with the index?
I had nothing at all to do with the index, but my major peeve when running I Ain't Been Shotman when I haven't run it for a few months is trying to remember where the flipping X some of the rules are.
Yes, because I mean that is one feature. At times, you find that particular rules are embedded in text, and it's knowing. I mean, having they are well laid out and with the way the text the text box are numbered and this the way it's done in the way that a lot of rule books are done. If anybody's ever read any technical manuals, it's a very similar sort of thing. Yep. So really easy to index and find stuff as long as everything's labelled correct.
I found one of the problems I had every time I umpired a game of Chain of Command, the British would want to fire smoke, and I couldn't find the smoke rules. So having an index that says light mortars, page 43, makes my day, actually. That's going to be so much easier. We should also add that if you've been in any way involved in the playtest or you've seen some of the games on the table, what you won't have seen is the scenario lists and the army lists, which are really what make it absolutely killer.
Indeed. It's, and obviously, I mean, when we reviewed the game, we reviewed the gameplay. A couple of the rules at that time didn't exist, or were just still in playtest mode, not so much that they were open to general release sort of thing, and obviously we were just told, okay, this is what you're playing with today. Now I've
playtested at least 3 different sets of armor rules, I think.
And obviously, as you say, one reason why we've got Mike talking about this is that Mike was on the playtest team, so he's got a few insights from that side of things. I
wasn't lucky enough to playtest with the St Albans crew, so unfortunately I suspect there are cases where I've certainly made mistakes while playtesting, but I think that's part of the way that Rich wants to work, because it allows us, every time we gamed, I sent him a list of, we did this, and this, what did we do wrong, what did we do right, can you clarify this in the next set of rules, etc., etc., etc. And I think there's been enough groups of people doing that I think they deserve quite a bit of the credit for the quality of what's finished, the finished product looks like.
Very much so, very much so. So, as I say, in what we're talking about now, we're not going to talk at least in depth in any way, shape or form about the basic mechanics of the game. We've already covered it. Don't necessarily want to reinvent the wheel. We spent a lot of time talking about it, but just to kind of, okay, if you haven't heard of Chain of Command yet, one thing I would to do, go back and check out the 2 shows that we did on Chain of Command. Having said that, very, very brief overview. It's a game of 2 halves, or you have a pre-game phase and the game itself. So you have a patrol phase at the start of the game, which you play out with blinds, and that ends up sorting out where your deployment points are. The game works on dice activation. So you roll a number of D6. Depending on what those D6 are, you are allowed to do certain things, activate individual weapons teams, sections, leaders, or there's a couple of special things that you can do, depending if you roll 5s and 6s. It's a very fluid turn sequence. So you can, because you have a number of phases, and the turn ends either when somebody chooses to, because they have an option from a Chain of Command dice, or you roll 3 6s, and the turn then ends. Okay, so some effects of weapons and things like smoke and what have you, and some effects of like being on Overwatch or going tactical, which is
also units that are broken, i.e. have more shock, that have too much shock. If you can't rally it off before the end of the turn, the unit will rout.
Yes. So you got things like that going on. When you haven't got a fixed end of the turn, they make those things a little bit, they kind of concentrate the mind a little bit more, shall we say.
Wonderful.
So you've got that. The game is very much aimed at a platoon level. There have been some thoughts that, yes, it will support more, but the basic game itself is aimed at an infantry platoon plus support. That's the level it is aimed at from both sides. Okay? And that's basically it as far as the general overview of how of the bare mechanics. You are allowed to move and fire, and officers can issue orders to troops. So you can activate troops from leaders in their vicinity. And the big thing as well is it's designed to work around real world tactics.
In fact, if you are fighting against someone who is using real world tactics and you're not, you will get parts of your anatomy handed to you on a plate.
Indeed. Oh, yes.
And deservedly so.
Yeah, because the one important factor which I haven't mentioned, in an awful lot of games, and this is right across the board as far as genre is concerned, but especially in modern war games, the majority of rules limit ranges of weapons to basically trying to force the players to maneuver. in order to get into range. In this game, with the exception of things like pistols and submachine guns, and some handheld anti-tank weapons. So, with the exception of pistols, submachine guns, infantry-fired anti-tank weapons, and a couple of other bits and pieces, hand grenades and stuff, basically, if you can see it, you can shoot it right across the table, because it's real-world scale. Was it 12 inches equals 40 yards?
It's effectively real-world scale for 15 mil. If you're playing Chain of Command in 15 mil, then table scale equals figure scale.
Yes. So I think I worked it out that effectively, if you played on a 6x4 table, with the ground scale, you're covering 6 to 8 acres, I think it is.
Sounds about right.
Something like that. So, it works. So it works on realistic ground scale. So there's nothing. There's nothing about you can't fire at me with your rifle because your rifle, a rifle only has a range of 24 or 30 inches, for example.
It is though worth noting that rifles and machine guns and the like do have close and effective range.
Oh, certainly.
It's worth getting in close if you can.
Oh, certainly, yeah. And close range is usually under 18 inches. However, you'll find that things like, especially machine guns, and especially tripod-mounted machine guns, yes. You try and come up. You try and go up against one of those, and you're in a world of hurt. You suddenly realise why things like the MG42 was an effective weapon as it was.
Tripod mount MG42 is 10 dice worth of firepower and reduces your cover by 1 level. It's going to ruin your day. Indeed.
And when you consider that, I mean, even as the as the LMG version, you have they roll 8d6, and when you consider that a Panzer Grenadier platoon is deploying 6 of them. You suddenly realise, and you come up with exactly the same sort of issues that the bog standard Allied platoon commander would have had.
And why the German platoon commander uses the periodic authentic tactic of having the machine guns as the fire base, and basically just pounding this crap out of you, to be bluntly.
That's it. And this is something we talk about national characteristics, and some people would turn around and say, well, okay, that's making the Germans overpowered, and affects game balance. And
obviously it does, because they won the war. Wait, no.
But the bottom line is, these rules are actually designed around history. And so, historically, the Allies worked out tactics for how to get around German defensive tactics. It works in exactly the same way, and that's one thing, you will find. And the game has been designed is that if you use real-world tactics, whichever side you're using, they will generally work. Yeah. So there we go.
You'll also note, we'll get onto it in more detail, that the German army list, for example, suffers from the fact that they've lost half their good leaders on the Russian front. And so while the British don't have the firepower of a 42, they do have two senior commanders. They've got a platoon sergeant and a platoon commander. To the Germans, 1, which gives the British considerably more flexibility.
Indeed, and you wouldn't. I mean, in some ways, you kind of think, okay, one figure, what difference does that make? Again, the way the game is structured, command is important, command and control is important, and if you've got the flexibility of platoon officers being able to direct fire, and they give bonuses to various different bits and pieces, being able to direct troops, it makes your force much more flexible. I mean, we talk about the command dice. 2 of your dice are about activating leaders, and then those leaders can subsequently activate troops around them. If you haven't got the leaders in the first place, you're already struggling. So this is where the advantage is with and the disadvantage lies between different troops. So despite the fact that on paper you may seem that, especially something like a Panzer Grenadier platoon, has a huge amount of advantage in firepower, actually they are a lot more balanced than you might than you might actually think.
Yeah, it's also worth bearing in mind that the scenario system will ensure that if you take, say, a Panzer Grenadier platoon, the British will get slightly more supports than they otherwise.
Indeed. So I think it's best if we actually start talking about this. Okay, so we've kind of outlined the basic design philosophies, but how has this happened in practice? And this is what we haven't seen before the rules were published. Okay, so let's talk about scenarios. So in the book we have 6 basic scenarios. Mike, do you want to outline what they are?
Oh, sorry, was that my cue? Right, yeah.
Sorry, I do this to people.
All right, that's all right.
Okay, do you want to take us? Do you want to basically take us through this bit?
I'll run this through. Yes. So we have 6 basic scenarios. We have the patrol, which is your classic encounter between 2 platoon-sized forces. We've got the probe, which is a defensive scenario where the attacker is basically probing a piece of terrain that has the defender is currently in possession of. We have attack and defend, which looks like a slightly larger scale probe. We have delaying action, which basically is the defender is blocking off the tables run long ways. The defender's blocking off one end of it, and the attacker has to capture one of his jump-off points. Otherwise, the defender wins. There's a flank attack, which is just an interesting way of, you look at it as an interesting way of setting up the defender in one corner of the table. And there's an attack on objective. They're all basically subtle variants on platoon versus platoon, but the key thing that they all include is the concept of supports, which is actually quite key to the whole thing. And I'm now going to try and explain this without using the word points, which could be quite tricky.
Because the game does not use a point system.
Of course it doesn't. Essentially, all the scenarios you are told that you may choose supports. Now, each force in the force list, and we'll get to those in more detail later, has a force value. A force rating is what it calls it, associated with it. And this could be anything from -5 for a bunch of German Osttruppen to, +7 for a elite Panzer Grenadier squad, +8 for British Paras, that kind of thing. And you take the difference between the two, plus any adjustments there are from the scenario, and each side gets, based on the scenario, to choose from a set of support lists. And these are numbered 1 to something like 11. And
well, it depends on your army. Some only have 8 or 9. One, I think it's the Germans have 11.
You have 9, and so on and so forth.
Yes.
Essentially, what you do is you use the parameters of the scenario and your forces to determine how many what your support value is, and then you may choose things from the support list that add up to that support value. Now, looking at, for example, the British one, List 1 has things like a mine-clearing team, a minefield, a jeep with no crew, a sticky bomb, an adjutant, which allows you to order more troops around through your jump-off points. List 2 has a Piat 2-inch mortar. List 3 has things like an M5 half-track or a universal carrier with a machine gun team on it. List 4 has a Vickers MMG, a Bofors, a Fu, and a 3-inch mortar battery. I'm just pulling these out as examples.
Yeah.
List 6 has an M4 Sherman. Now we get into the interesting stuff.
Yes.
Or an M10 Wolverine, or a 17-pounder. List 7 is Firefly, Achilles, Cromwell, Centaur, Challenger, and Churchill. List 9 is a Churchill AVRE, things like that. And if you go right the way up to the German list, the List 11...
That's things like Tiger 2.
Tiger 2, Jagdpanther, Sturmtiger, and Jagdtiger.
Yes.
Now, it's worth bearing in mind that these are in addition to your core force. Unlike something like bolt action, You can't cut yourself a core force from a points list. I've used that word, but not in the context of chain of command, note. So in bolt action, you could, for example, decide to go with 2 sections and a whole bunch of armor support. In chain of command, you can't. You've got to use effectively a platoon order of battle that will be appropriate for the period you're working in, plus some support selecting from those that your company or battalion might choose to make available to you.
Indeed.
So effectively, you are a proper platoon commander, plus you have support from company, and you can ask up to a point for supports. And this basically does mean that you are down to using realistic tactics much more than you would be with something like bolt action.
Now, in addition to this, as we already noted from the scenarios, the majority of the scenarios are attack and defence based. So correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but I believe that where you have an attacker and a defender, the defender gets half the number of points for support than the attacker does.
So what happens? Let's say, for example, I'm flicking pages here. Bear with me a second. If I'm playing one of the attack-defense scenarios, so you compare the 2 force ratings. So if one force is +2 and one is +1, then there's a net strength difference of 1, in which case the player of the weaker force may increase the level of support available to him by +1. So, for instance, if I had +5 and you had +2, then you would get +3 on top of whatever the scenario gives you. And as you say, if it's an attack and defend scenario, typically the attacker will usually roll the dice to determine exactly how many he gets. Sometimes it will be a D6 and you can choose from the list that corresponds to that number. Sometimes it will be 2D6 with 11 or 12 counting as 10, and so on and so forth. So if you're the attacker with a +3 force and I have a +5 force defending, you roll 6, so you will get 6 support value plus the 2 for the difference between you and me, and I will get half what you rolled, which is 3. And that's how it works.
Now, as you say, from that you can choose either one thing from one list or 2 things from two smaller lists that add up to your total support factor. But it's interesting to note, and it's designed around the fact that you are an infantry platoon, and at this point, the majority of what we're talking about here is infantry platoons. Okay, so you are only likely ever to be supported by, say, a single tank. So the one thing it does encourage you, and especially as you start looking down the lists, you start looking at actually what becomes much more useful. Is it more useful to have a single tank, or is it more useful to have things like a medium machine gun and a mortar battery? You start, or do you want to take a couple of reconnaissance vehicles rather than a tank, because actually they are much more flexible in what they do. So that's sort of things you start having to sort out when you're sorting your army lists. And actually, the one thing which I think is quite nice, it really encourages you to use the little stuff. Things like armoured cars, half tracks.
Bren carrier with a Bren suddenly becomes a really, really mobile source of 6 dice of anti-infantry fire.
That's it. And you start looking at something like an M3 half track with a 50 cal on it, or a 251 with an MG42 on it, and all of a sudden they become major sources of firepower. And
it's interesting that despite that, you plonk a Panzer IV on the table and everybody panics.
Oh, certainly, and of course, because of the way the scenarios work, you aren't necessarily guaranteed to have anything to face. Say, I don't know, if somebody put, let's say, I don't know, a Churchill on the table, for example. You may not have the firepower. You may not have deployed an anti-tank gun. So you've got to rely on things like infantry anti-tank weapons and stuff like that. So it does mean that you end up in situations where you really do have to think on your feet, and you're in situations realistically where you are facing a force that you just have to go with and cater for, and it's not dominated by armoured vehicles.
No, it isn't. Absolutely no. It's very much designed as platoon. Rich describes it as platoon plus, and that's exactly what it is.
Indeed. So we talked about scenarios. We started talking about the way the force lists are made up, and as you say, depending on which force you're playing. Now there are 4 forces in the main rules. Okay, so you've got Brits, Americans, Germans and Russians. Effectively, you've actually got 11 army lists. Okay, so for the Germans, you've got Panzergrenadiers, you've got Fallschirmjäger, and you have standard, infantry. For the Brits, you have infantry platoon. You have motorised infantry platoon, and you have airborne. For the US, very similar. Rifle platoon, motorised rifle, and airborne. And for the Russians, you've only got a couple. So you've got the rifle platoon, and then you've got that word which I can never pronounce. But they're basically the tank riders. So they're the platoon that are armed with submachine guns and are known for riding tanks.
You don't expect me to try and pronounce the Russian?
I was hoping since I chickened out you might have a go, but there you go. Okay, so within the basic rules, you've got 11 army lists. And they are subtly different.
But not so subtly different in some cases.
Well, yes.
Something like the Panzergrenadiers with 2 teams in each section, each of which has an MG42. As we said earlier, they're really going to ruin your day.
And these are historical orders of battle. And it's not about picking and choosing. It's about a case of, okay, I want this, I'm having a Panzergrenadier platoon. There you go. There's your Panzergrenadier platoon. It's and that's your base force. As we've said, it's balanced out with support options. So if you've got a Panzergrenadier platoon, you know that you're going to be facing a reinforced platoon from the opposition. Obviously, you're not going to know what you're facing because your support choices is up to your opponent. And if he wants to share that with you, then fine. But I think it's more fun if you don't.
Indeed, and the other nice thing, of course, is that you can and should be picking your supports in a sensible and realistic manner based on the scenario and the terrain you're in the process of entering.
Indeed.
You really might not want to take a Churchill down a road that's littered with bocage hedges.
I couldn't possibly think why.
Particularly if you know somebody sitting at the other end with a Panzerschreck or 2.
I think we're just taking advantage of the fact that Mr. Hobbs isn't on this part of the podcast. But there we go.
Why do we do that?
Indeed not.
The other thing to note, if we've got to the end of once you get past the end of the army lists, is there's a very nice section, which one of the last things Rich wrote, called Train for Command. And that actually goes through how the training manuals for particularly the British, the American, well, in fact all of them, including the Soviets, were encouraged their platoon commanders to use their forces. There's even a page from the 1944 British Army Training Manual on how a platoon is supposed to approach a strong point, which I believe is the scenario that Rich stuck in last month's Miniature War Games, isn't it?
It's in Miniature War Games 364, and that's the one. And that's the one where I think I mentioned it that he got an email from some people saying, "I'm sorry, that scenario is broken because it doesn't work." Looking at from what Rich has shared on the Yahoo group, I think it's fairly apparent that those people were playing bolt action.
Well, that if you look at that map in the rulebook, when you get to it, you'll see that looks like it would fit quite nicely on a 6x4 table.
Indeed.
And strangely enough, weapon ranges are most of the table. In fact, they're all the table.
Yes, and that's why it doesn't work with bolt action, because basically you're... and again, this is something we haven't talked about yet, but national characteristics. It's kind of covered in this part that Mike's talking about, but then relates back to particular national characteristics of how each individual platoon fights. They get bonuses for doing things in certain ways.
Basically, each force has a couple of special rules, such as the British have that good old British classic 5 rounds rapid, which allows you to give a rifle team extra fire dice by activating with a leader. And the Bren's rather notorious for being too accurate for its own good. So you're allowed to spend command initiatives to actually focus fire against a single team, even when it's within 4 inches of other teams. And there are similar rules for all the other forces.
Indeed. So, for example, with the Germans, you've got rules surrounding junior officers directing fire with the MG40, the bipod mounted MG42, and also use of stormtroopers or stormtroop tactics for a grenade attack followed by close combat. US talks about what's it called? Marching events? Marching fire. Basically talking about the fact that because the US had a semi-automatic rifle with the M1 and with the BAR in support, they had an advantage in effectively advancing firing from the hip, but also their use of scouts. And same goes for Russians. Russians were, famed for their use of scouting forces. And one of the things, this is something we picked up in the second show that we did, actually doing things like using scouting in chain of command is really important.
Yeah.
Because part of the kind of like, the meta game, if you like, around chain of command is effectively trying to get your opponent to deploy before you do, so you know where his force is deployed. Because as we've come across, or as we mentioned before, when you start the game, nothing is deployed on the table. You know there are certain deployment points where you can deploy and where your enemy can deploy, but it is totally up to you where and when you deploy, obviously within the confines of what orders dice that you've rolled. So, with the fact that if you're using scouting forces, you can start to get very close to where the enemy jump-off markers are. If they're not stopped, you can actually start capturing your opponent's jump-off markers. So, which means that they are then removed from, they end up being removed from the table, and your opponent can't use them anymore.
Which costs him force morale. Did we mention force morale?
Well, we mentioned force morale in the basic rules, but essentially what you've got is the fact of you have a force morale level, and that's between 8 and 11 normally, depending on it's randomly generated, but is obviously dependent on what force you're using as well. But losing troops, losing officers, and losing things like jump-off points adversely affect your force morale. It's fine to begin with, and as you get low and low and low on your force morale, it starts to limit what you can do. You start getting less command dice and that sort of thing. At that point, you're usually in real trouble. But one of the things it is very useful for scouts to do is to move forward and try and capture jump-off points. Because it means that in order to stop them doing that, your opponent has to deploy forces, and therefore it starts putting figures on the table. Remember, you've only got a platoon aside. So, it is all that side of the way the game works makes things very, very different from where you might have a standard game where, you are deploying within let's say a 4 foot by 8 inch or 4 foot by 12 inch rectangle on your side of the table, and then moving from there. It makes it for a very different game, and in some ways it's a little bit cat and mouse, but very, very interesting.
I noticed a description, I think it was on the mailing list today, that it does tend to cause battles which are an awful lot of careful manoeuvring and then several phases of flat panic, which seems entirely appropriate if you read some of the first-hand accounts of the period.
Certainly, it's very much a case of feeding out your opponent, and then at the point where you think you have an advantage, trying to press it as quickly as possible, and your opponent frantically trying to respond to what you're doing.
Yeah. I would strongly recommend to anybody who's listening to this who hasn't yet, both checking out on YouTube the series of videos, which I think you mentioned in one of the previous podcasts, of the whole game mechanics. But on top of that, on the Two Fat Lardies blog, Rich and Nick have gone through several battles on a phase-by-phase, dice-roll-by-dice-roll basis. So, and talked about their thinking as they've done it. And those make really very instructive reading if you're going to play Chain of Command.
Indeed. In some ways, it's potentially a different game to what you're used to as far as World War II is concerned, especially if you've played an awful lot of the platoon level games in recent years, possibly with the exception of things like Force on Force. Going back to, I remember Battleground World War II, which was Easy 8 Enterprises. That are much more detailed set of rules, but allowed you to do similar sorts of things, but nowhere near as simply and as elegantly. So, as I've said in a couple of places now, for my money, it's the best set of modern skirmish rules that I've played. And that's in coming on for 25, 30 years.
Not going to argue with you.
In some ways they are quite revolutionary. And a lot of people might turn around and say, well, actually, they're taking, effectively you're taking a couple of ideas from various different places. You're mixing them up and putting them out in a slightly different way. But the way they've done it, and the few extra bells and whistles they put in, make it for it is very different, very, very satisfying experience.
Yeah, the Lardies maxim being play the period and not the rules. The thing that Chain of Command brings to this is that the rules are sufficiently simple that it doesn't take long before the fact that you're consciously applying rules for the largest part vanishes, and you just wind up ordering troops around in a way that seems to make them behave in a period-appropriate way with period-appropriate command effects. Don't ever try close assaulting a German Panzer Grenadier squad, for example, unless you've broken it pretty much first.
Indeed. And if you let if you're assaulting any sort of German unit, if you let them get a firebase of 2 or 3 bipod MG42s, you are in a whole world of hurt. One thing that Mike Hobbs mentioned when he was playing, and the difference with what we were doing when we were playtesting, we pretty much had encounter battles with the scenarios that they put in place. It does give you, quite clear objectives in a lot of ways, and that does make a difference. That does make a difference to the way you play the game. But yes, as I say, very, very good set of rules. It's nice to see it all out in print, and it's like sort of thing that you might want to read through a couple of times before you give it a go. But by the third or fourth time that you're playing, the majority of stuff will come pretty much intuitively.
And the other thing I would say is that for all that there's a set of pre-written scenarios at the back, once you've played those a few times, you will get the feel for how to not necessarily balance, but provide supports to forces to produce an interesting scenario. That's such that if you want to pick an encounter like, say, for example, Brecourt Manor, you do this. You could do that using Chain of Command very, very easily, or even Pegasus Bridge. Although I suspect that might be a bit big. It'd be interesting to try a small action based on Pegasus Bridge, for example, especially with what Warlord just announced.
Oh, no, certainly, yes. So, I mean the one downside from originally looking at the book, and some people will say, well, it doesn't have a quick reference sheet in it, and it doesn't. Having said that, there is one that is free to download. All the patrol markers are free to download, and so everything that you need to play the game is freely available once you've got the set of rules. You don't need any special dice. You don't need, and the quick reference. Say quick reference sheet. It is like 4 pages, but that includes all the results for firing against vehicles and what have you, because there are quite a few different results tables that you potentially roll on if you're firing against vehicles, depending on what type of vehicle you've got and the sort of armor penetration you've achieved. Now, one thing I must admit I mentioned and we haven't covered, and you said it earlier, because it's that one thing that majorly changed was an ambush rule, which wasn't in the set of rules when I played it. It's a special rule that comes part of spending what they call these chain of command dice. It's basically a bonus dice that you can accumulate, and when you get to a certain number of points, you can then use it for a special action. One of those special actions is setting an ambush, which you could effectively do within the game itself, but this gives an extra level of setting these things. It's a new way of doing things, but basically you can deploy. Is it up to 12 inches from a deployment point?
I have the rules right here. You can deploy up to 12 inches of a friendly jump-off point and more than 6 inches from any infantry. The enemy infantry. You can then fire immediately without further activation. And if you aren't killed, and you're not the kind of thing which can't move and fire in the same phase, you can disappear again afterwards.
Which is incredibly powerful for things like Panzerschreck teams and bipod mounted machine guns, and like Bren teams or that side of thing. Incredibly powerful piece for creating a situation which an awful lot of games struggle to do, because of this thing that you always see all the troops on the table. And because you have this thing implicitly within Chain of Command that not all the troops on the table, and you don't know where your opponent is deploying until it's his choice where and when he deploys his forces, operating within obviously his Chain of Command dice. Things like these ambushes and stuff are they happen easily. Yeah. And yet it's something that, especially when you're talking about things like, Normandy bocage and that sort of thing, it's the sort of stuff that used to happen all the time.
Yeah, I've seen the criticism of Chain of Command that the jump off points are teleporters. But I think it's something we need to make fairly clear, is that the design philosophy behind them isn't that. It's that they're secured spots to which your forces can get from their O group location, wherever their platoon commander is, by sort of crawling through cover, ducking under hedges, etc. So it's not that troops mysteriously appear there. It's generally deemed that there is a route to there, and the ambush is just an extension of this.
That's it, and obviously, with this thing of actually this extension of actually capturing opponents' jump-off points, that also gets to the point where, again, so effectively what you're doing is you're getting to the point where a place where you could previously securely move your forces to is no longer secure, and therefore you can no longer move there. And that's the philosophy behind it.
Very, very pretty, and it works. The one other thing that we nearly got onto mentioning we is the bundles.
Oh, yes.
I don't know what you ordered, but my copy of the rules turned up with a very nice set of logoed Chain of Command dice and a whole load of pinned, broken Overwatch and tactical markers. I didn't order the resin jump-off points. I don't know if you did.
I didn't order them. I may have got a set to review.
Oh, no, the joys of running a podcast, eh?
Indeed, Rich was very kind. Yes, I ordered a bundle with full set tokens and the Chain of Command dice and stuff, and Rich very kindly included a set of jump-off markers. The reason I didn't order the jump-off markers was I originally wasn't going to play this in 28mm, because the jump-off markers are in 28mm. Having said that, they are very nice.
And you're going to buy some 28mm World War II, aren't you?
No, I've got a whole load of 148 scale stuff, mate. which I was going to sell, and I'm not anymore. I've got more World War II armour in 148 scale than is really safe to have. I can basically field of all the main battle tanks. Well, at least for the Germans, US, and Brits, I could field a tank troop.
And of course, the beautiful thing about it is, if you're the kind of person who just loves collecting individual examples of tanks, that's all you need. Indeed.
But at the same time, if you fancy, I mean, one of the refights that Nick and Rich did actually involved using a troop of British Shermans with a Firefly. Now, currently, looking at the standard options, that isn't available as an army list.
Unless you have a support value of about 22.
However, having said that, it doesn't cover that in the rules, Mike, you welcome Mike Hobbs into this discussion. Mike, you actually raised this on the Yahoo group, didn't you?
Yeah. Hi everyone, I'm back again. I remember reading the blog post that you put out. I think it was their first live game, and as you said, Mike, they had second. That's right, yeah. And they had the three tanks there, which I think were support options. But I just sort of thought, could you do it where your core choice, instead of being an infantry platoon, is a tank platoon, which means that you then have to support a troop. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, because otherwise, you don't need pushing 10 tanks around you.
No, sorry, yeah, a troop of sort of 3 or 4 tanks.
Yeah.
So that becomes your core. So you have your senior leader in one of the tanks, plus another 2 or 3 supporting. But then you have to equip your support elements from the current lists. And I think that there's so many pros and cons of doing that. I'm going to try with some of the guys on the club, just because I got loads of 20mm tanks. But I think I think the rules will handle it. I think you may have to play around with how you bring stuff on. Maybe if you're in a sort of defence position, you place your tanks close to a jump-off point, and that's where they start the game. Or you bring them on as normal. But I think it'd be an interesting one to try out. And I can't see it breaking the game at all.
Because I was looking at a similar sort of thing with playing around with things like US cavalry forces, for example. One of my favourite forces from World War II are the US cavalry reconnaissance troops. So, with the mortars with 30 cals, 50 cals, and M60 mortars in jeeps, with whites and supporting M8s and stuff like that, and having a platoon which is effectively divided up in 2. So you got units in white hard tracks. And again, I suppose if you look at a US motorised platoon from the force list and start thinking, okay, well, actually, rather than just having them deployed on foot, each unit would have to have, the weapons team would have to have 3 jeeps, and each squad would have to have a to have a half track, and you might have a supporting Greyhound armoured car. How many supporting points is that sort of thing? And then work out, say, okay, well, actually, if that works out to that size force, then you've got to work that out for your opponent. I don't know if that sort of thing will work.
The only risk with that is that you do lose the magic of the pre-game phase, because vehicles deploy from the edge of the table, with very few exceptions.
Yeah, I think that's right, Mike. I think that's something you may want to drop in as... I'm sort of thinking that opening scene in Kelly's Heroes, where they're sort of lagged in the barns. So you have your sort of attack and defence scenarios where if you're defending, you can pop some vehicles on, but maybe you don't have the crew in there. But it's a thing, and it's actually a very clever thing with the army lists, is that quite often, especially with half tracks, you buy the half track without any crew, which means that you've then got to crew it, and there's no weapons in there either. So, for example, in our first game, the Germans had a 251 with no crew, which meant he had to put one of his MG42 teams to crew that particular half track.
Yeah.
And that, again, that works really well, because you're not getting this great, if you want to have a half track with a mounted gun on it, you've got to buy the gun separately. That all costs from your support list choices.
And if you look at the British support list, for example, an M5 with no weapons is list 3.
Yeah.
It's dirt cheap.
Yeah, it's dirt cheap, but you've then got to get the sort of 50 cal or the 30 cal, which would come in, I think it's list 4 for an MG, isn't it?
It's a Vickers for the Brits. It's fundamentally, it's the same, pretty much the same stats as a Brownie. It's quite interesting to note that when we did Charles Grant's action at Twin Farms under Chain of Command, but the Germans, we used pretty much the forces that were set out in battle, if you remember back to that old classic of the genre. So the Germans basically had a squad and a half, 2 machine gun teams and the rest of one squad, plus Panzerschreck and a senior officer, against 3 motor sections plus a 2-inch mortar in 3 M5s. And we still played the pre-game phase, because that sets the limits of how far the Germans can deploy.
Yes.
But the British then, because they could have chosen not to come on in half tracks, but the eastern edge of the map where the Brits come on is very empty, apart from about 3 stone walls. So in fact, both the times we played it, the British came on in half tracks and ran the gauntlet of Panzerschreck fire, which is quite entertaining and a little nerve-wracking. And it does work. Yeah.
No, I think the whole thing would work. It's a very flexible and a very solid set of rules, and I think whatever you chuck in it, as long as you're historically accurate, would give you a decent outcome.
So one of the more fascinating things is that it doesn't do you will obey historical tactics. It really just is a set of rules that makes historical tactics pay off, and I think that's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, I agree. I think the only thing I think they could do is you always assume to have a full platoon when you start, and I sort of wonder how historically accurate that was, whether they could have done something in the scenarios to sort of say, or even maybe in the force morale sort of roles, to sort of say, like, you always start off with your full platoon, but before you start the game, there's a chance you might lose a couple of figures, or your commander might be, of a lesser quality because he's brand new to the front or something like that. Whether they could have just sort of turned that screw a little bit more and just sort of said, right, this is your base. Now we're going to take some stuff off you, or we're going to add some stuff back onto you if you did well.
Definitely. One of the things that Sidney Roundwood and I were discussing was the idea of gluing together Chain of Command and the whole sort of role-playing aspect of the Lardy's platoon forward.
Yes. Now, if you're not aware, there is a PDF supplement which came on sale about a year or so ago from Two Fat Lardies. I forget off the top of my head who wrote it, but it's called Platoon Forward, and I believe I actually reviewed it on the show. I think if you look for it in the show that includes Surf's Up, I think I did in fact review it there, but I stand to be corrected on that. However, so what you actually got in Platoon Forward is you, although it's kind of aimed at the time and designed around the mechanics that work with either Ain't Been Shot Mum or Troops, Weapons and Tactics, which have a different set of deployment criteria. I mean, you can change it around and it'll basically work. In that supplement, not only you define your platoon and all your platoon leaders, so you effectively roll up characteristics for your platoon leaders to give them strengths and weaknesses. Or like say your platoon officers and your section leaders. But then you also have a campaign system which actually contains, I think it's 18 different scenarios. Again, a lot of them subtle variations on attack and defence. And then within that, you then have things where basically you have pre- and post-game phases. So, incorporating that into Chain of Command, it seems to make perfect sense. I mean, what sort of ideas have you had behind it, mate?
I was more thinking, given that I'm, as you may have noted, currently running a very deep Dux Britanniarum campaign with lots of quite in-character stuff, I could see applying that kind of feel to Chain of Command by using Platoon Forward and getting something that almost has the Dux Britanniarum campaign feel.
Yeah. But again, that would have implications between games on things like what your forces are. Well, certainly from one side.
But I think you'd make it only affect your core platoon. And you'd still get the supports from company, and maybe some of the bits of Platoon Forward that actually govern who you've made friends with up in Quartermasters or your company CO may affect the roles you get for support value and things like that. It'd be quite interesting to try.
It would be quite interesting to try, but yes, agreed. I mean, if you look, especially with what Mike's saying, certainly if you look at, I think Vietnam is a classic example where an awful lot of rules, especially at platoon level in Vietnam, give you paper strength of your platoon. So you sort your platoon out before you start the game, and then at that point, you then kind of go, okay, let's find out if you've got a full platoon or not. And you effectively you actually roll for each squad and see if you've got some guys wounded or off on leave or that sort of thing. And agreed, that's operating with that sort of thing. Some people might argue that it's introducing a random factor into the game which perhaps you don't need. But as you say, at what point did, especially after 2 days, for anything from first or second day engagement on for the majority of the rest of the war, what platoon operated at full strength?
Yeah, I don't think you need to do much. I don't think you need to sort of decimate the platoons, but it'd be nice. Stuff that just makes you think as a player. It sort of throws your battle plan out a little bit. I personally like games where you're playing not just against the player, but also against the game as well, and where you got some random elements that are going to affect your battle plan. And
or to put it another way, you're actually commanding human beings, not bits of plastic.
Pretty much, yeah. I think it's probably why I like Force on Force so much, is because it's a game that makes you think about your casualties. So you're not just saying, I'll just throw this squad in and try and break through, because that has an effect. And this is another game like that, where everything you do has an effect. You're not going to just chuck a fire team or a whole squad against a squad of Panzer Grenadiers, because you're going to get mullered, and that's going to affect your morale and possibly lose you the game. So you need to think out of the box a lot more. It's a similar thing with the Battlegroup games.
Yeah, no, I have to confess that I've not played Force on Force, or for that matter, had a very close look at Battlegroup. So, how do they compare on that front?
Force on Force is a bit of a difficult one to compare because it is sort of modern combat.
Is there not? I thought there was a World War II equivalent version.
Interestingly enough, when Osprey, when it was originally marketed by Ambush Alley Games, Force on Force was both modern and World War II. When Osprey took it over, they then basically turned around and said, "This is modern." Okay, and having talked with them, there was various comments about, well, we felt we wanted to concentrate it on post 1945 sort of thing, and that's really kind of where it fitted. That's where it fitted. And then within 12 months, they published Bolt Action. I would leave it open to the people to interpret those events and the order of what they happened in any way that they would.
Possibly commercially, Bolt Action was a better decision.
Yeah. But having said that, when you look at, but that's what I'm saying as far as, yes, Force on Force did originally have a World War II, a World War II bolt-on for it. Now, in the same way that you have with things like, with Chain of Command, Force on Force uses effective weapon range and the fact that the majority of the time you can shoot right across the board. It also includes things where you have to take account of the casualties that you are taking and the morale effect that those casualties have on the rest of the force. So you start ending up in a situation where you're having to deploy parts of your force to look after your casualties if they are not killed. That is something that we think about a lot more in terms of modern combat as opposed to World War II, but that's the way that Force on Force is geared. So, for example, if you were looking at, let's say, Mogadishu, which is, or as you say, anything to do with Iraq and Afghanistan, which is kind of where Force on Force is currently pitched. There is a huge emphasis on making sure that your casualties are looked after. And actually, at the point where, it's always said that at the point where you start taking casualties, effectively you lose the initiative. Because you start concentrating on looking after your casualties rather than just concentrating on what the enemy's doing. And part of the way the mechanics of Force on Force work is geared towards that.
Yeah, and it's very clever, and it makes you think about playing. It's the only game I've ever played where I really cared about my casualties, because you just see them as just figures on a table. You don't think of them as flesh and blood, which is odd for wargamers to probably say that. But I think we have to I think most wargamers have an emotional detachment to the figures on the table. They see them as just they're just pieces. You don't think about the human suffering that that comes on with this.
Yeah, I think this is where the semi-RPG elements and things like Platoon Forward and Dux Britannianum really work. I was quite surprised how many complaints I got when my noble in Dux Britannianum, Leofric the Drunkard, actually got killed in battle, and I was quite gutted as well.
Yeah, because you start to emotionally attach yourself to those. I think most role players go through that, but as a whole with wargaming, you look more at a higher level. You look more at the tactics, or you look at the uniforms, or you look at the style of the game. You don't think about human suffering. If you did, this would be a pretty sick sort of hobby, But we don't. We see it as a game, that simulates sort of history. But Force on Force makes you really think about that side of things.
Does it have a campaign game as such?
Not so much of a campaign. So there's link scenarios and so forth.
That's because part of the way Dux Brit and Platoon Forward do it is they effectively apply a context to any battle you fight.
The original version of Ambush Valley, which is the Vietnam supplement for Force on Force, the version that was published by Ambush Alley, as opposed to the version that is published by Osprey, does have a campaign system in it, and a similar campaign system based around effectively going through a tour of duty.
This is one of the reasons I love Dutch Sprit, is that whole context thing, and why I'd be really keen to try and explore something similar with the Chain of Command campaign.
Yeah, and I think it'd work with Chain of Command. I think it's that solid.
Well, if you look at Sidney Roundwood's blog, I think he started that with his campaign. If you read his campaign narrative for the fight,
yes, I read that
the other day. That was brilliant.
Yeah, very clever.
Yeah.
But you're talking about the Battlegroup game. I mean, Battlegroup is completely different. Battlegroup is a similar, even though you can play it at a sort of squad and platoon level, it comes into its own at, I'd say, company level, Neil, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I'd agree with that, yeah.
Yeah. So it's a similar scale to I Am Being Shotman, Flames of War, other games like that. So it's difficult to sort of compare those, but Battlegroup has got some quirks. It puts a lot of micromanagement into the vehicles, not so much into the infantry, but you need to have the infantry support there.
To compare, Battlegroup has a lot of logistical concerns that you have to think about, as opposed to necessarily. I mean, certainly you've got morale concerns with your infantry, but as we mentioned earlier, when you're looking at the differences between the style of game between something like Battlegroup and I Am Being Shotman, for example, where Battlegroup is concentrating more on armoured vehicles than it is on infantry, as a sweeping statement. So you're dealing a lot more, as Mike said, micromanaging logistics of vehicles, and starting to worry about things like, hang on a second, I've got a slight problem because my tanks have just run out of anti-tank rounds. We've got armour advancing up the road, and I've got to somehow try and do things like resupply them with anti-tank with some new anti-tank rounds before they get wiped the floor with. So you start getting that sort of level of management, especially in company level games.
But it does force you to have a very balanced army, which is one thing I do like about it. The sort of three tiers of the armour, the artillery, the infantry working together.
Oh yeah, and this is where you suddenly discover that actually you start getting things where actually it's not a tank's job to defend against tank. It's actually an anti-tank gun's job to defend against tank. So you start getting that differential because of the difference in the way the armament works, and exactly what things can carry. So that all that combined arms logistics operation that you have to consider works really well within Battlegroup. But as you say, that starts thinking about a completely different scale to what Chain of Command is at.
Well, I think the thing is, it's a great time to be a World War II war gamer at the moment, because with the same sort of core types of troops. I mean, if you've got a 20 mil company of troops plus some support, there's so many different types of games that you can play, and each of those games give you a different feel, completely different game. And it's almost like today I fancy playing a quick and dirty game, so I'm going to play this game. Tomorrow I fancy doing a really long, in-depth game, so I'm going to play this game. So it's great. I mean, I love the fact now that I've got armies that I've had for donkey's years, and I'm using them again.
And more to the point, don't any of the currently available rules have really strict basing standards?
No, that's right.
So that perennial question that tends to get on my nerves after a while is, can I use X forces based for X with Y? The answer is hell yes.
Yeah.
I know I've been giving Bolt Action a hard time.
But if you weren't, I would have been.
Yeah, but even so, and this is a discussion I think myself and Mike have had on certain occasions. If nothing else, bolt action has suddenly made World War II accessible to a whole different genre of gamer. Okay, we may not agree with the way it represents World War II, but it's made World War II accessible. And as Mike says, you put together a 28mm platoon for bolt action that is then usable for chain of command almost without any change, as long as you've got a full platoon, of course, and haven't just tailored it to a power gaming force or what have you. But
which is the one danger with a system like bolt action.
It is. But at the same time, as you say, some of it you've got to accept the fact that I think even with the likes of Flames of War, it's made World War II much more accessible than what it was, even 5 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, my personal view, I don't like bolt action as a game. I don't like Flames of War as a game. But God, I'm glad that they're out. Because Warlord are just throwing out so much good stuff now that you can use in your games.
Like I said on the previous podcast, the fact that Battlefront exists makes playing I Ain't Been Shot Mum so much easier.
Yeah, I've got to say with Battlefront, I like the fact that you can go and buy a box and know that there's a platoon in that blister, or there's a company of figures, and they're pretty much okay. I mean, they're it's very rare you pick up one of their company sets and find that they've not put enough of a certain type of figure in there. I much prefer to do that than to do what we did 10 years ago, which was hunting through various sort of magazines trying to think, right, I need 4 packs of those and I need 7 packs of those, but that's going to leave me with umpteen figures that I'm not going to use.
I think the hardest problem I've ever had was actually trying to find a Panzerknacker squad, which I ended up going to Peter Pig for.
Yeah, but now there's so many firms out there producing good quality stuff
in every scale.
In every scale, yeah, and it's great, and okay, don't like bolt action, but I've seen it being played, and people who play it really like it. And at the end of the day, that's all that matters. As long as somebody enjoys a game.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it's not for us, fine, but I really like the fact that they are there. Otherwise, I'd be hunting around various firms trying to find somebody who does a particular type of Panzer IV that I'm currently after, or an equivalent.
Yeah, and then of course you had Will and Plastic Soldier Company, and the world's your oyster.
Oh God, yeah, it's great. There's a lot of choice.
Indeed. And as you say, it's a case of, because of the amount of choice out there, it gives us all the option to play the games we like, but because you're now in a situation where, well, as you said, Mike, you look at the collection you've got. Once you've got a painted company in anything, certainly anything from 15 to 28mm.
Or in Mike's case, everything from 15.
Oh, yes, quite. I wasn't going to go there, but since you did, that just gives you so much flexibility in what you can do, and you can play the game that floats your boat. But as I think we've hinted today, from a platoon level side of things, I think Chain of Command's a bit. It's a game changer. I really, really do. I sincerely hope it does as well as it deserves to, because it is a brilliant set of rules.
I think it will. And I think there's going to be a lot of firms who are going to benefit from it.
Okay, the other thing to say is that if you are a bolt action player, once you've got that force, Chain of Command is not terribly expensive. You almost owe it to yourself to give it a go, especially if you buy the PDF copy.
Yeah,
indeed, and actually, it's probably from a rule set point of view. Although you turn around and say, okay, it's 70 pages worth of rules, it's probably less complicated because there's less things to think about. Like, what's the range of a bolt-action rifle as opposed to a carbine? Or what's the range of an MG42 compared to a Bren gun? You don't have to think about things like that. And, the mechanics are all very, very similar, and so at least, I would say the very thing is at least give it a try. You may be very pleasantly surprised.
And watch the videos.
So what forces have we all gone off and bought then? Anybody gone and bought anything new?
I haven't actually bought anything yet. I have most of a German platoon I painted up for Opera Squad, if anybody remembers Op Squad.
Oh, yeah, Opera Squad.
Yeah.
We used to play quite a bit of Op Squad at the club, which is really more squad level rather than platoon level. But I have about 2/3 of a platoon and most of the rest of a box of the Warlord Plastic Germans, which I'm probably going to finish off. I have a section of Paras, which I'm going to turn into a company, and I am going to go and splurge out on the Foundry Home Guard.
Superb.
Because somebody has just published version 2 of the Home Guard list on the Lardy's Yahoo group, and I so want to give that a go.
I think Warlords are producing some new ones fairly soon. I'm sure I saw something on their blog about it.
Yeah, I'm sort of working on the theory that there will be the inevitable Foundry sale at some point.
Yeah, there always is.
Yeah.
And I mean, Foundry have got their act to get back together, and now the new guys have taken over. They're starting to get their act together.
It does look that way, doesn't it?
Which is good to see.
It is.
Yeah, so that's where I'm headed. Gary at the club's got British and Germans and several people with Americans, so we've got enough forces at the club we can do most things. I've also got a complete box of Plastic Soldier Company Russians I should paint up at some point.
Which, what scale?
28.
28.
Yeah, for all that 15mm is the actual ground scale, they look so good at 28. Particularly if we as a club just splurged out on an awful lot of Last Valley Bocage.
Oh, yeah, which is really nice scenery, yeah.
Fantastic. And I want some of the HCA Normandy buildings and some of the foreground stuff as well, just to add to that, and it will look really good. I'm also getting some of the stuff from Kickstarter, from the Kickstarter from Commission Figurines, which I think I mentioned last time.
Oh, yeah.
Which will also...
ruin buildings, yeah.
Yeah, we can do things like try out Chain of Command on the streets of Berlin.
That'll be interesting.
Yeah.
Won't it?
Mm. Yeah, or even going back and yes, Berlin would be the ideal one. I mean, you could go back and do Stalingrad, but you need to amend the forces slightly. Oh,
they are bringing out the steam mill for Stalingrad as part of that Kickstarter.
Oh, right, okay.
Which I think we also still have an order. So, what about you guys? What are you planning on painting up for Chain of Command?
Go on, Neil.
Well, I say, Mikey. I mean, Mike, you basically got everything, haven't you?
I've got my old 20mm Normandy stuff, which I had for Battlefront World War II, which I've now just sort of repurposed. Up until about 3 months ago, I didn't have any 28mm World War II at all. I never wanted to play it. But I've now got a American infantry sort of platoon plus some support.
Because Warlord did a really good platoon deal, didn't they?
They did, yeah. It was £60 for 2 boxes of plastic infantry, a Sherman,
M3,
an M3, and a 50 cal and a mortar, which obviously you don't need. Which is pretty much all you need to get going. For £60, I thought, well, I like that.
That's pretty much a platoon plus all the support list you could ever want, isn't it?
Yeah.
Pretty much, yeah. So, and then I got another pack of the infantry, so I could do another squad plus, some bazookas and medics and, various sort of hangers-on. So I've done that. I'm just starting on a Fallschirmjäger platoon in metal. And for some reason I managed to to order a box of the Perry's 8th Army figures.
That's new.
Yeah. I saw this blog and there was some really beautifully painted 8th Army. I just thought, oh, they look so good. And then I looked at the Perry's pack. I thought, ooh, £18 for a whole platoon. That's all I need. And they're easy to paint. They're only sand. So.
Now, you really do have to use your drill period book tactics with that.
But that's what I thought. I thought, I didn't want to do. I was sort of thinking of maybe doing sort of Burma. But I thought, that's like sort of Normandy, which is my main armies, which is very terrain heavy. I thought, well, let's do something completely different. Let's do North Africa. It's going to be very terrain light. That'll really make the rules stand out.
There is a great example fight through on the Lardy's blog of a terrain light battle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does open your eyes to the use of tactics.
Yeah. Plus it means I can buy some Vickers tanks.
And some DAK when they come out.
Yeah. Well, I might do Italians.
Well, that'd be different.
That'd be different, wouldn't it? That'd be fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, do the really early stuff. Do sort of 41 over in North Africa. So it's tiny little tanks, and lots of men running around. And I think that'll be interesting. So that was my justification for buying the 8th Army box set.
Up until a few weeks ago, I was convinced that I was only going to game this in 15mm. Now, I've had 148 scale. This is something we talked about. I had a shed load of 148 scale, which is they were originally done for Nick at North Star by Richard Ansell. Beautiful figures that Richard sculpted in 148 scale, and there's a whole part of the in hand in hand with the Project X range of alternate World War II figures that he did. They've all now been sold to Scarab. So Rob Broom at Scarab Miniatures is now doing all those, and he came out a few weeks ago, probably a couple of weeks ago, and said, "Oh, by the way, we're now working on the Project X rules."
So you look, they're effectively what, roughly 40mm?
36mm.
Right.
They're 36mm. So they work with 148, 150 scale vehicles, and I have a shed load of whether they be the Corgi, the old frog, remember the old Frog Fumin plastic kits? Before whoever was producing them basically ruined the molds. I've got a shed load of things like that, right back to things like Panzer IVs. I've got like an 88 anti-tank gun, loads of different stuff, and of course there's the Tamiya 148 stuff that Tamiya have been doing for a few years now. So I've got universal carriers and all sorts. So basically, I have enough stuff, including the troops, to do platoons of SS Panzer Grenadiers, German infantry, British infantry, US infantry, British and US paras, and could field a troop of tanks for all nations. I haven't done Russians. In 15mm, I have got enough for a full company of Russians, and the same with Germans. So I've got a shed load of stuff to go at, and as I say, up until very recently, I was about to get rid of all my 148 stuff, but that really is ideal for chain of command. Yeah, they are lovely figures. They'd still work with the ground scale. Okay, they might look a little bit big, but to my mind, they'd still work with the ground scale. The only problem is with those ranges at the moment is that they're lacking in big support weapons. So you haven't got things like tripod-mounted machine guns. You haven't got medium mortars. However, I have been assured by Bob Broom that they are coming out. Really, the major thing that was missing are things like the tripod-mounted MG42, the Vickers, and things like the US infantry haven't got 30 cal machine guns, whereas the paratroops have. So there's little gaps in the range. But Rob assures me that that's all being addressed as part of the Project X rollout in the next few months, which means that actually, if I actually sit down and make an effort and actually paint something, I could do it.
I was about to ask how many of them were painted.
Yeah, a couple of squads. Again, it's one of these things of it. It was a project that went on the back burner and hasn't come back. And then, as I say, I went for 15mm. So what I might end up doing is painting some 15mm stuff first. So I end up doing Russians and Germans first, because I'm still waiting for Plastic Soldier Company to release US heavy weapons. But yeah, so definitely Chain of Command 148 scale. Although I will be, I'll be potentially trying dual base stuff where I ain't been Shotman and Chain of Command where possible. So there you go. That's what that's kind of where I'm at this moment in time. As per usual, dithering around, can't decide what I'm going to do. Haven't painted much at all. Right. Okay. So I think we've come to a natural conclusion on this World War II special. Thanks both for joining me.
Not a problem.
You're welcome.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah, so I hope you found the conversation useful, and so we're giving you some insights, say, into Battlegroup Overlord and especially Chain of Command. As ever, enjoy yourself gaming, take care of yourselves, and all being well, we shall speak to you very soon. Bye.
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 Thank you for listening to the Meeples and Miniatures podcast. If you want to know more about Meeples and Miniatures, there are several things you can do. First of all, you can visit the website at www.meeplesandminiatures.co.uk. If you want to contact the show at all, you can email me at neil@meeplesandminiatures.co.uk. You can follow the show on Twitter. Simply look for M&M Podcast, or click the follow us on Twitter button from the website. We also have a group on Facebook. That's the Meeples and Miniatures Podcast Fan Club. Again, follow the link from the website. And finally, if you want to help to support the show, you can always donate to the podcast by clicking the PayPal button on the donate page, again found on the website. Once again, thank you for listening. I hope you've really enjoyed the show. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.